Hi there, and welcome to today's Art of Procurement. And I have an interview with two guests today. But before I introduce you, I do want to thank you a lot for the kind comments we received following the mixing up of our This Week in Procurement newsletter. It really means so much to get that feedback. And if you haven't checked it out yet, we send it every Friday. It goes to the Art of Procurement email subscribers. So just head on over to artofprocurement.com, sign up to the newsletter, and it's going to drop in your inbox every week. So today's guests make it a continuation of the theme of Australasian interviews to start 2018. I'm actually joined by Margaret Gilbert and Anthony English, and Margaret and Anthony both recently co-wrote a book called Procurement Risk, a practical guide for buyers and suppliers. Margaret's based in New Zealand. She's a prolific author in the world of procurement and runs her own procurement consultancy and training business. And Anthony spends most of his time today actually as a business coach, but he also has a deep background in providing IT support such as data migration across Australia, related mostly to IBM Power Systems, both for IBM and as an independent consultant. And so our show today, actually in spirit of the book, takes a deeper look into risk across the supply chain, but from both the buyer and the seller lens. So Margaret provides the buyer perspective and Anthony the seller perspective. And I find it really interesting to get the provider, the seller point of view, as it's something that we often don't necessarily think about or understand as a buyer. And so in my first question, I actually asked it to Margaret, and I asked if the responsibility for risk management should be shared between both the buyer and the provider.
Just sort of an automatic assumption that it's going to be lumped on the supplier. And I come from a buyer background, but I don't think that's fair. And since fairness is one of the procurement principles, let's get real and let's look at how both sides can work on this and achieve it, and to reduce or mitigate the risk is what we're supposed to do, and just sort of look at sort of maybe sharing the cost of the risk rather than just letting one party wear it all.
Yeah, whoever bears the risk.
But that's not really real. That's not really real anyway, because as I said, the supplier will just pass the risk on to the buyer by way of higher pricing.
Yeah, the cost is absorbed and passed back on to you. So whoever ends up bearing most of the risks ends up paying the price for that.
Yeah. Well, I also see from the supplier's point of view, that obligation to, like the suppliers, sometimes the people that you end up dealing with, like a supplier themselves may, for example, we see this in the IT space, you may have a supplier who then suddenly outsources everything themselves,
right?
And you sort of say, look, this is not what I signed for.
Yeah.
And what used to take me just a few days is now a months-long project, and I don't even know who we're talking to. I don't have any. So the supplier themselves have really not fulfilled their obligations as regards to the risk. They've said, here is what we're providing. Here are our SLAs. Here are our KPIs, and then they haven't gone anywhere near meeting them because they've just gone and said, okay, and now we're going to do this on the cheap. And so that's something that is, you speak rightly, Margaret, about the buyers not doing themselves any favours, but I certainly see this with suppliers who are doing the same thing.
Yeah, and that's another area, and in my world, it's called scope creep. It means that the scope has changed from whatever.
We all know that.
But the supplier hasn't adjusted to the fact or gone back and said, hey, the scope has changed, so therefore, the extra piece of work will need to be priced separately, so to speak. Again, this is risk stuff. You're right, Anthony, this is risk stuff.
So let's assume that as a buyer and a supplier, we need to commit to essentially sharing risk between ourselves, not putting it all on one side or the other. What are some of the risk factors that we actually need to be aware of as we start to factor in, okay, how can we start to monitor, manage and mitigate the risks that may exist?
If you look at risk, it comes down to three areas, doesn't it? It comes to high risk, medium risk and low risk. And then it's a matter of how to reduce that risk. And of course, you can't just ignore the medium risk or the low risk, because if you ignore it, it could become high eventually.
Right.
And people, when they do focus on it, focus on the high, But and sometimes it might be a good idea if the risk is too high just to sort of wait until it's been resolved before carrying on and doing. But there's such a rush to sort of say we've got to do this that they can, risk is forgotten.
Yeah, it's
and it comes back and haunts you later.
Yeah, sometimes the risk is so high that you should be questioning whether you should even be buying this in the first place. Maybe you should be making it internally.
So one of the risk factors is time. Another risk is inability to see what risk is there and how to reduce, or just ignoring altogether, or putting it all on the supplier, which is what we've just been talking about.
Yeah.
Could I just add there that, business is really about risk, okay? And so just as Margaret said, we're talking about, high, medium, low risk, and those can change. Those can change over time. But you're not going to eliminate risk.
They can change fast too.
True, but you're not going to eliminate risk, and that's not the point. You're not there to say, we want a completely risk-free investment. I want to invest this money, and I want 100% guarantee that I'm going to get this return on this money, absolutely 100% if anything goes wrong. It's like that's not the nature of business. The nature of business is not to say, we will not have any risk. The nature is to say, let us manage it. And one of the best ways of doing that is simply assessing it. And so rather than having some nebulous, what is this big storm that's going to hit, we don't even know what it is, let's see if we can pinpoint it. Let's at least take away some of the uncertainties. And how are we going to mitigate that?
Yeah, so
I agree with that.
So kind of scenario planning as an example. Look at the things that are likely or may have some probability of occurring, so kind of plan out what that scenario could look like. And then once you're doing that, you can at least start to understand what the impacts could be. Now, it's not that actual scenario may map out over time, but at least it starts to give you some idea of where the weaknesses are within your supply chains, for example.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is, even if it's not too high a risk, is that you need to document it so that you're at least aware of it, and so you can go back to it if you need to and take some action. It's the whole, if you don't write it down, it kind of doesn't exist, or if it stays in somebody's head, that's fine. But if that person leaves the organisation, what then?
Right.
So that's a risk factor too.
Yeah, definitely. You're looking for single points of failure, and just not assuming that just because this link in the chain always works. You're always looking for some alternative, okay? If you can't fly, then are you able to catch a train? Or are we able to do this remotely? For example, you're always looking for some alternatives to protect yourself, especially for those things where there are a number of dependencies further down the chain.
Anthony, from a supplier perspective, how do you think about kind of risk tolerance? How do you set risk tolerance? Because you said before, you can't mitigate all risks, and business is about risk.
No.
Where's the line?
Well, what I always like to do is go back to what is the business outcome here? What is a good result? And what are we actually trying to achieve? So I might ask very high level or open questions like, what is the end game here? I gave a talk at a procurement conference several months ago, and I had an example of it was quite an interesting one. There was a tiger in a zoo that needed root canal surgery. Okay. Right. Now, I want to imagine, Phil, that you're the dentist. Okay, you're the tiger dentist. How are you going to protect yourself from risk? Now, I asked the lawyer this, and the lawyer said, make sure you've got insurance. I said, insurance is not going to protect you from risk. You're going to die if the tiger wakes up. The way that you protect yourself from risk there is you make sure the anaesthetist is the first one to go into the cage after he's put the tiger to sleep. Yeah. Okay, so he's taking the risk on himself. Yeah. That I absolutely know what the business outcome here is this is actually here is what success means. Here is that this tiger will stay asleep for the whole of the root canal surgery.
Yeah, he's willing to put his body on the line for that.
Exactly. And so that whole idea of ownership of risk and understanding, what actually is the business outcome? Because very often people will come in, and procurement people may do this. I certainly see it in other areas of the business, where we just say, look, I need this. And they don't really know why they say they need this. They've been told, I need this. And take a simple example, something simple, building a website. Yeah. I need a website. Well, hang on. What do you need a website for? Like, if that website was an employee, what would be its job description? What is the end game here? Because maybe you don't actually need a website, or maybe you don't need whatever you're looking to supply. Yeah. Maybe all you need is, what is the actual business goal that you're after, you see? Maybe all you need is somebody wearing a sandwich board, and that's how you're going to be advertising your business. You don't actually need a website. Okay, fine. Yeah. So what is the end game here? That's a very important question that I like to ask. Yeah. What is the business outcome? How will we measure it? How will we know if we're there?
Procurement people, though, don't think of it as business outcome, Anthony. They think, okay, we've got to buy this or that, but they don't think it is a business outcome. They might think about it in terms of procurement terms, so to speak, but they wouldn't call it a business outcome. I like your analogy about a root canal, because sometimes when you go through a procurement process, sometimes it feels exactly like that root canal, because not everything's done the way it should be done, the right way.
Yeah, it's because our objectives are not necessarily aligned with each other, are they? As a supplier, right, you have one objective. As a buyer, you may have something that conflicts. Yes. But I do think that we're making strides. I think I'm going a little bit of a tangent, but I see more and more organizations do think about business outcomes, and buying outcomes and solving challenges, as opposed to maybe traditionally we didn't think like that. I want to go back to something you said earlier about monitoring risk. You said that we assess risk based on high, medium, low. And, yes, we more often than not focus on all the high risk and medium and low. We may think, well, that's low risk. I don't really need to worry about assessing that again until maybe the contract comes up again in 3 or 5 years' time. But of course, conditions change. Risk profiles are always changing. And it's never something that's static. So I wonder how you recommend that folks could actually think about the ongoing monitoring of risk, especially when, it's not possible to monitor everything, but so they're at least keeping tabs on what they may have thought were low or medium risks, as the risk profile changes. Yep.
Well, this comes into the area that, and unfortunately, is that once the contract's signed, is that often it gets put away in a drawer and forgotten about, and then not until and using your example, 5 years later in terms of renewing it again. Well, I'm not a believer in that anyway, but also because it seems to me is that you need to keep monitoring over the time of the contract, because there could be circumstances that change that brings that risk, from low to medium or medium to high. And that needs to be part of a conversation between both parties saying, well, look, whoops, since we started this and we know there is this risk, and so how are we going to manage it? There has to be a conversation. You can't just ignore it. You just got to sort of, keep an eye on it and have the conversation if the risk starts to increase. And if there's a new risk that turns up during that time of the contract, then that equally needs to be considered and worked through. And that's where it needs to be an honest conversation between buyer and supplier.
One of the things I like to do is make sure that you have your post-contract signing governance. And as part of that governance process, always make risk a topic of conversation. It could be that it's just at the bottom of an agenda, but it means that you're going to consistently have a placeholder, a reminder to talk about it. Because, it often gets missed. And again, it's not because we're being... We're deliberately ignoring it. It's just, there's other things in the relationship we need to talk about, but at least just having it as part of governance helps keep it on the agenda. So you do continually touch base.
If you can see that the risk is increasing, then it needs to be on top of the agenda, and it needs to be a part of, or should be a part of, the regular monthly meeting that you have with the buyers have with the suppliers, or should have with the suppliers. and talk about it then and start looking at it early rather than waiting until it becomes a horrendous problem.
I know, and that's where risk management becomes a competitive advantage, isn't it? Where you're actually being proactive and understanding and identifying risk up front so you can react quicker than those around you, as opposed to a risk event happens and you're kind of running around like a headless chicken trying to figure out what to do while because you're in panic mode. And that's where it's kind of the difference between a positive outcome and a negative outcome when a risk event does happen, because
it's not a good place to be running around with your running around like a headless chicken.
Right.
Well, we've all seen that in the airlines. In the airline space, every few months we'll see that an airline's booking system has gone down, or the flight scheduling system, or something like that. And it doesn't actually crash planes, but the disruption is obvious to everybody, and it's all over the news. And we see it in the banking sector as well. And those of us who are not actually don't have our finger on the pulse necessarily in those systems, from the outside we say, oh, can't they just press a button?
Right.
Surely. So the assumption is, from the outsider's point of view, surely they have some alternate system in place that is going to just kick in. Mm-hmm. And once you're actually inside the system and actually working on it, you realise that no, they don't actually have that. Yes, they should, but it really comes down to not having assessed, managed, and really dealt with the risk. It's just a whole lot of assumptions that it's all going to be okay.
Sometimes I think that, we have, as procurement, we have the best intentions in mind to bring a risk outlook to what we do. And then we where we really struggle is being able to influence our stakeholders to take risk seriously. And it's not that it's not that just because they have a high risk tolerance, it's because they don't think risk is important to them. Risk isn't going to happen to me because I'm responsible for managing call centers, and they're in a physical location, in one single location. I'm not moving goods from country A to country B. So why do I even need to be worried about it? I'm interested in some of your experiences in how we can actually influence our stakeholders. And I think, Margaret, for you, it's our internal business stakeholders to take risk seriously.
Yes, indeed. Well, one way to sort of solve some of that, and what also doesn't happen but should happen more often, is that procurement, and Anthony was talking about silos before, procurement stays in its own little silo and waits for the organisation to come to them, rather than the procurement should be going out to the organisation. And that way you can start educating what procurement needs, but equally, and so therefore you can also influence the stakeholders in terms of what the possible risks are for that particular procurement. The problem is that people come to procurement at the last minute and want an instant result without realising the tender process will take 3 months. They want it today. There's all that stuff.
Yes, that whole word urgent. I've learned, as you get older, I've learned not to trust that word.
Yes.
Somebody will come to you. I came across this just very recently. It was in the IT space. Somebody said, we have this urgent project. It was affecting payroll. The payroll was running fine, but it was a big, potentially significant change to payroll. Not a lot of work necessarily, but it was potentially going to stop payroll. And this was an urgent thing. I said, well, hang on, wait a minute. How long have you known about this? And it's been, I said, why do you say this is urgent? Like, is it urgent that we're actually going to risk bringing down payroll? I mean, how? It's just a question. It's once again, it's that whole silo mentality. It's like we need to be able to step outside our own silos, and that's what I have done as a supplier coming into the procurement space.
So I have just two final questions today. The first one is really to help any listeners take some action items away from the conversation today. And I think about procurement organizations being in one of two different places. Either they don't have a formal risk management program in place, or perhaps they do and they want to take it to the next level. So the first question is really, for that company that doesn't have a formal risk management program in place, what are some of the actions that you'd recommend that a professional within that organization actually take to better manage the risk across their portfolio?
I would think that if a company does not have a risk management plan, then I think that should be a really urgent matter to be taking up and to put something in place as a protection for the organisation, but also for procurement and for the contractual obligations that they are both sides are committed to. Because, if you don't manage your risk, then it can become a problem for you during the term of the contract.
Right.
So sooner or later, you're going to have to deal with it. So it's better to deal with it early and know how to manage it than sort of act and be in a crisis halfway through if something occurs.
Yeah, and I'm thinking of perhaps a buyer who recognizes the importance of risk themselves, but maybe their organization doesn't. They may not be in a position to influence the folks in their organization to put that in place. Is there things that they can do at a portfolio level? So at least they're protecting their own stakeholders. Yes,
indeed. Well, it's a case then of just sort of taking it on board and in your own workspace and making it happen and do put something in place in terms of risk and at least have a conversation.
One way that I would approach that is to bring together some of the key stakeholders and make it extremely simple and simply hand them a Post-it note to each of them, and you say, just write down your top 3 issues that you think we've got to address, and then we simply go around the table. If we have 7 people there, and between the 3 of us, between all of us, we have 21 issues, well, then that's an issue in itself. We can't even agree what is the most. So, and then you measure success by how many of those issues we've crossed off the list. Whether it's a monthly meeting or something, but we simply walk through. We say, well, look, I perceive that this is a risk in our supply chain here or there. We've got a warehouse filling up, and we're not going to be able to. We're not going to be able to deal with the new orders, that are coming in. We're not going to be able to handle it. I perceive that this is a problem. Do you think that's a problem? Let's work through that. And so what you're doing there is really making it very concrete and getting them to be very, very specific, because everybody's aware of risk in some particular angle, some particular aspect. That's an approach that I would find, quite helpful.
Yeah. And how about for a company that has already invested in those formal processes and procedures? They have data, they're being pretty successful in influencing stakeholders. Is there something that they can do perhaps to take the management of risk to the next level, even, further? What does best-in-class risk management from a procurement perspective look like?
Well, even those organisations that do have something like that, it's often just a tick-the-box exercise, like we have something, and so now we move on to the next buzzword, so to speak, and then they still don't apply it in the day-to-day, and it's the applying in the day-to-day that has to happen.
Yeah.
And that's going to and it might be a case that procurement can push it for all they want, but they might have to sort of get buy-in from management, who can then, I hate to use the word impose, but impose in terms by way of policy, perhaps, that these things need to be taken account of.
Yeah, it's focusing on execution.
And that might have to be the next step, Or let something. I mean, you could always take another approach, which I don't recommend, is let it fail and then sort of pick up the pieces later. Except that that's not usually a good idea.
No, we want to be proactive, but saying that, when we think back to, I had a question before about influencing stakeholders. Unfortunately, while we don't like it, fear does sell. That's why it's all over our newspapers and TV screens every single day. Sometimes you have to. It's not like you're doing it deliberately, of course. But when there's an event that's happened, as procurement, we can be there to help alleviate the issues that problem caused. But that's the point when we've actually helped alleviate a situation. That's the point where we have the most leverage to then try and institutionalize, for the want of a better word, the idea of risk management practices, because that's when the organization has been at its most vulnerable and we've actually shown the value that we can bring.
You've just mentioned before, Phil, the business continuity plan, that BCP, or disaster recovery. And what I like to do is say, well, instead of just asking the technical people, what do we need to do here? I would be asking, well, if that system does go down, an ERP system, for example, goes down, or if this supply chain breaks at this point or that point, whose job is on the line? Because that's the person to be speaking to.
Yeah. You know, I got one last question, actually, Anthony, because you mentioned BCP, the business continuity plans. I think when I put my procurement hat on, I would always ask if a BCP existed, but I would, once somebody said yes, a BCP existed, it was almost like a check the box. Okay, it's there, I don't need to worry about it. And of course, there are different flavors of BCP. It may be a 1-pager, it might be a 200-pager, but as a procurement person, I would never really know how thorough it was, how well tested it was, how built into reality it was. And so I wonder, as a procurement person, what are the right questions that we should be asking of our supplier so we could better get a feel for the resilience of the BCP if there was an event that was going to happen?
Well, perhaps you should be asking for...
Well, one thing is certainly to be able to test it effectively and to set yourself some really serious SLAs. So those service level agreements that because I'm actually from a very strong IT background, and so I have done business continuity plans for major banks and so on. And there are so many times where they're relying on some workaround or something like they're really cheating along the way. It's very, very common. And so that's a question of finding out, well, who is going to own this? Who is going to is going to be able to sign off and say, yes, we were able to get that system, that computer system, for example, back up within this specific time, and we had to do it assuming that one person who's got all the knowledge in his head wasn't available.
Right.
Yeah. So you're really asking a little bit of an uncomfortable question. Yeah. But it really needs to be asked because there are some very shoddy practices out there, I'm afraid to say.
Is it realistic as well for us to ask, to essentially do scenario plans? So for me to ask you as a supplier, here's a scenario. I want you to show me how your BCP protects me if that happens.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think that's, from my perspective, I think that would be, if I'd have thought in that way, that would be useful because it brings it down to me and what I'm buying and what my company is buying, as opposed to, I think when I think of BCPs, I thought of them as more kind of vague or general or not specifically written for me.
And one way of doing that, especially during the tender process, is ask the questions. So when you invite them to come and to do a proposal presentation, is get them to answer the questions that you've raised.
Yeah.
And wrap that around risk and stuff like that. How would you manage this situation, etc.
So I know it's about time to start wrapping up, and I asked a couple more extra questions there on the end than I intended to, but I think BCPs are really important as a, it's something that a supplier hangs their hat on sometimes that we don't necessarily understand enough. So I definitely wanted to go a little bit deeper there. But my very last question, I always say it's the easier question. Where can listeners actually go to find out more, to connect with you both and to check out your book, which is Contract Matters, Procurement and Risk, a practical guide for buyers and suppliers? Where can they actually find that?
So we will have the link in the show notes there. It is available as an Amazon ebook. So that's for looking at it on Kindle, for being able to read on your laptop or even on your mobile phone if your eyes are good enough. And also Margaret and I are both very active on LinkedIn. Mm-hmm. And so that's a great space to be in, especially for the procurement people, because there's it's a great chance to meet really senior people across the procurement space, and share some thoughts here, which is a great way of doing it. Share those discussions, joining those discussions.
equally, Phil, another way for our listeners to get in touch is through Anthony's website and my website, and go from there, or email, etc.
Okay.
As it's an ebook, Anthony's looking after Australia, so to speak, and I'm looking after New Zealand, and Amazon's looking after everywhere else.
Yeah, absolutely. Amazon is everywhere.
Yeah, indeed.
And so what I'll do is I'll include the links to both of your websites, to your LinkedIn profiles, also a link to the book on Amazon. I'll put those in the show notes. Mm-hmm. The show notes are going to be at artofprocurement.com/procurement risk book. That's artofprocurement.com/procurement risk book. So, Margaret, Anthony, thank you very much for joining me today.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of The Art of Procurement. To find an archive of all past episodes, you can go to artofprocurement.com/episodes. And to ensure you never miss another show, go to artofprocurement.com/subscribe.